Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're jumping right into the tangled web of historical baggage and complex diplomatic jargon surrounding Taiwan. We really want to get to the bottom of the cross-strait status quo. It's a topic that is so often dominated by loud, flashing headlines, but to truly grasp what's happening today and more importantly what might happen tomorrow, we have to look strictly at the facts.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to move step by step through 1. The accidental status quo. 2. Shells, speakers, and balloons. 3. Decoding One China. 4. Taiwan's global workarounds. And finally, we'll wrap up with 5. Ambiguity versus clarity. Let's get right into it.
Starting with Section 1, the accidental status quo, and how the Korean War inadvertently saved Taiwan. We need to rewind to the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. The nationalist government had just retreated to Taiwan. They were defeated, totally depleted, and staring down an imminent, heavily prepared invasion by the People's Liberation Army. A communist takeover wasn't just a vague possibility here, it was actively being planned as the grand finale of the Civil War.
But look at this timeline because it reveals a really profound twist of fate. Notice how crazy fast things shifted in 1950. In January, the US explicitly stated Taiwan fell entirely outside its defensive perimeter. They were essentially hands-off. But then in June, the Korean War breaks out. Immediately, the US 7th Fleet is deployed to the Taiwan Strait. By October, China enters the war in Korea, suffering massive casualties in the process. And just like that, the strategic window closed. Taiwan's survival wasn't the result of some deliberate long-term diplomacy. It was accidentally preserved simply because China's military resources were completely diverted up to the Korean peninsula.
This quote brilliantly captures the dynamic that followed. The regular presence of the US 7th Fleet, which had destroyers rotating up and down the strait from 1950 all the way to 1969, wasn't just a static, unmoving shield. It was a precise political tool. Think of it like a volume dial, giving the US the exact ability to turn tensions up or down to prevent an all-out war between the PRC and the nationalists, especially since neither side was willing to sign an actual peace treaty.
Moving into Section 2, shells, speakers, and balloons. Because while a full-scale amphibious invasion thankfully never happened, both sides settled into this incredibly entrenched, deeply bizarre, 3-decade standoff. We're talking alternate-day artillery fire mixed with fierce psychological warfare.
57,000. Think about that number for a second. That is the staggering amount of artillery shells launched by the PLA at the tiny island of Kinmen in one single day, August 23, 1958. It absolutely tore the region apart. And the human cost? Just devastating. On places like Dongshan Island, retreating nationalist forces forcibly conscripted over 4,000 men in the early 1950s. They left behind what literally became known as a widow island, where families were separated without a single word for nearly 4 decades.
But over time, the battle shifted from high explosives to, honestly, pure ideology. It turned into a literal shouting match of epic proportions. Both sides built these massive 24-hour radio stations and giant speaker systems to just blast political taunts across the water. The PRC actually constructed the 9-headed bird. It was a 1.7-ton military loudspeaker that blasted slogans so loudly you could hear them from 12 kilometers away.
And to bypass the artillery entirely, both sides used coastal winds to drop the most bizarre payloads you can imagine using massive weather balloons. I mean, we're talking premium cigarettes, music cassettes, and transistor radios locked to very specific propaganda frequencies. The irony here is amazing, though. Taiwanese citizens actually started complaining about receiving way too many of Chairman Mao's Little Red Books. It got to the point where a paper mill in Taichung officially requested military approval to just recycle them all into fresh paper.
All right, part 3. Decoding One China. This is where we unravel the diplomatic verbal theology. By 1979, the physical shelling and those weird balloon drops finally stopped. But the conflict didn't end, right? It just morphed into a wildly complex diplomatic matrix, defined by what analysts affectionately call verbal theology.
The absolute core of this is the difference between these two super easily confused phrases. On the left, Beijing adheres to the One China principle, claiming absolute, undeniable sovereignty over Taiwan. But on the right, the United States operates under the One China policy. Notice the nuance here. The US carefully acknowledges China's territorial claim without ever actually endorsing it. It's a masterclass in semantic gymnastics that lets the US maintain unofficial ties with Taiwan while officially recognizing Beijing.
To make sense of how the rest of the world navigates this minefield, we can look at the Lowy Institute's 5 categories. Basically, the global community exists on a spectrum. You've got strict recognition of Taipei on one end, all the way over to full, complete backing of Beijing's reunification goals on the other. For context, most Western nations sit squarely in that status quoist category, right in the middle.
And what about between Taipei and Beijing themselves? Well, their relations have largely hinged on this, the 1992 Consensus. Now, despite the very official-sounding name, this was never a true finalized agreement. It was essentially a murky diplomatic loophole. Basically, by agreeing to disagree on what one China actually meant, officials on both sides could save face and, crucially, keep talking to one another.
Which leads us to Section 4, Taiwan's global workarounds. Because when you lack formal recognition, you have to get incredibly creative to stay relevant. Officially speaking, today only 3 Pacific nations, Palau, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands, actually recognize Taiwan. So Taipei has to navigate the global stage without a formal diplomatic passport.
But they have absolutely mastered the art of the workaround. Check out these 3 critical unofficial channels. They use TIFAs to secure massive economic engagement worldwide. They use the GCTF to team up with international partners on things like public health and disaster relief. And they set up these de facto embassies across ASEAN nations, operating exactly like real embassies in everything but name.
These shadow partnerships, if you want to call them that, are totally essential. They allow Taiwan to plug right into vital global systems and sustain a highly advanced, tech-driven economy. I mean, they produce the world's most advanced semiconductors. Through tools like the US-Taiwan Travel Act or the EU's Horizon Europe program, Taiwan makes itself absolutely indispensable to the world, entirely outside the traditional setup of the United Nations.
Finally, Section 5, Ambiguity versus Clarity. This is the modern dilemma. How on earth do we keep this incredibly delicate balance intact? Right now, there is a fierce debate raging within U.S. policy circles about how best to manage an increasingly assertive, highly modernized Chinese military.
For decades, the name of the game has been strategic ambiguity. It is classic dual deterrence. The U.S. doesn't explicitly promise to save Taiwan, which nicely deters Taiwanese politicians from formally declaring independence. But at the exact same time, the U.S. doesn't promise to stay out of a conflict either. That keeps Beijing guessing and hopefully deters an invasion. But here's the catch. As China's military spending absolutely balloons, there is a powerful new argument pushing for a complete 180. A shift to strategic clarity. The people backing this argue that the era of playing guessing games is over, and that in the 21st century, only an absolute, unwavering, locked-in commitment can prevent a catastrophic war.
So, looking at this completely objectively, here are the 5 main arguments for clarity. Advocates argue that ambiguity simply doesn't scare a modernized PLA anymore. They believe that showing incredibly strong resolve is the only way to keep a nuclear-armed state in check. Plus, they argue an explicit commitment is desperately needed to reassure Pacific allies, like Japan and Australia, that their own regional defense preparations aren't just in vain.
On the flip side, we have 7 big arguments for sticking with the status quo of ambiguity. Defenders highlight a really grave risk here. An explicit U.S. commitment could be viewed as crossing a major red line. It might actually force China to attack immediately, just to save face, literally starting the exact war the policy is trying to prevent. They also argue that ambiguity gives the U.S. much-needed diplomatic flexibility and forces Taiwan to take its own military preparations seriously, instead of just coasting on an American guarantee. Ultimately, we are left staring at a profound divide between moral clarity and strategic utility. Pretty much everyone agrees that a war over Taiwan would be a global catastrophe. The entire debate is just about the best mechanism for prevention. So, as you digest all this history, the diplomatic loopholes, and the sheer scale of the military stakes we've covered, ask yourself, in a world where one miscalculation could trigger a global conflict, does the best chance for peace require drawing a hard line in the sand, or continuing to navigate the gray areas of ambiguity?